Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. Shameful retreats are in the air. Chuck Schumer, the head of the Democrats in the Senate, has angered younger Democrats for his supposed shameful retreat on the shutdown. A lot of people are very, very angry with him, including, in particular, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, who is the leader of the Young Democrats, perhaps to the left of Schumer. Meanwhile, that's not the only shameful retreat that's grabbing some people's attention. My guest today, an old friend, David Masciotra, has an interesting new piece in Salon. He's a contributing editor over there, contributing writer. And he's very critical of what he calls the Democrats' shameful retreat on trans rights. He has a strong piece in this week's Salon. David, as always, is joining us from Highland, Indiana, where he lives. David, before we get to your Salon piece, what's your take on Schumer? Do you believe it's a shameful retreat?
I can understand. Schumer's been obsequious for months now, and rather pathetic in his lack of fire, or lack of protest, lack of outrage over Trump's dismantlement of the civil service, of social services, and even of some of the pillars of democracy. So this joins a pattern of surrender. And although I could see some savviness in the strategy of allowing the Republicans to pass a budget that will invite outrage from most of the American people, cutting Medicaid, cutting student aid, and other programs on which many people depend and take for granted, this is a time to fight. And as many Democrats have pointed out, including AOC, this isn't just an ordinary budget because it includes provisions that allow Trump to coalesce even more power. So it looks like, what's the point of an opposition party if that party isn't going to oppose those who occupy the seats of power? So, yeah, Schumer needs to go. He's looking rather inert and helpless. Perhaps his best days are behind him. And, we need new leadership that's willing to rise to the occasion and show some aggression against this assault that the Trump administration is subjecting the people of the United States.
Is it a generational split, do you think? We mentioned AOC. She's been very vocal. This might be her moment. Do you see a split within the Democrats between the old guard, the Schumers? Pelosi now has gone. Biden, of course, has gone. And the younger generation, the AOCs. I mean, Bernie Sanders, of course, is older. I assume he's no great fan of Schumer.
Right. Yeah. Generally, there's a generational divide, but there are exceptions. So Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader of the House, is really no better than Schumer. I mean, you probably heard how he chastised Democrats who disrupted Trump's bizarre address to Congress, and he's gone on this media tour of self-flagellation about what the Democrats have done wrong and what they need to do better. So Jeffries, although he's closer to AOC in age and residency, he's from Brooklyn, is in many ways just as pathetic. It seems as if Democrats have become frightened, and I'm not sure why. It was a close election, and they lost under terrible circumstances, and they have tens and tens of millions of constituents who are longing for a fight, who are longing to see them defend their interests. And Bernie Sanders is doing that. Chris Murphy's doing it. Governor of Illinois, Pritzker, is doing it. And there are various members of the House, like AOC and Jasmine Crockett, who are doing it, but they're not in leadership positions. We need leadership willing to bust down some doors and break down some barricades in a metaphorical sense.
Well, this comes to your piece on the title. I'm not sure if you came up with the title. Democrats stage a shameful retreat on trans rights. Do they think that that will stop Trump? I have to admit I'm in two minds on this. When I first saw it, I thought that a focus on trans would be a political mistake. But the more I think about it, the less sure I actually am. Where are you coming at this from, David? Why did you particularly focus on trans rights as opposed to there's so many other issues you could focus on? I mean, there's a full frontal assault by Trump and the MAGA movement on democracy, on individual rights, on foreign policy, on so much else that's going on in the world.
Well, first of all, my focus was somewhat responsive to the inordinate focus that the right-wingers running on the toxic fumes of Christian fundamentalism have devoted to the issue. 41% of Trump's ads in the campaign targeted transgender Americans, trafficking in slander and stereotypes. State governments across the country.
Let's repeat that. I had no idea on that, David. 40. So you mean 4 out of? Is that just within the content, or is that more than 4 out of 10 of the Republican ads focused on the issue of trans rights?
Well, not Republican ads, but Trump ads. So
right,
I'm not sure about senators and governors, but Trump ads.
So 4 out of 10 of the Trump ads prioritize the issue of trans, right?
Yes.
So they're, to put it mildly, fetishizing this.
Exactly. And then Democrats have had a disproportional focus on it as explanatory of their defeat. So there are a number of Democratic Congress people and consultants.
Yeah, you list them in the piece, including, surprise, surprise, Gavin Newsom and Rahm Emanuel. So
they're all saying that this is the reason we lost, because a few years ago we supported human rights for everyone with the application toward transgender men and women. And I decided to write about this for 2 reasons in response to your question. First of all, to return to that phrase, human rights for everyone, civil rights for everybody, should remain non-negotiable elements of the Democratic Party platform, certainly of a progressive political agenda. But then also...
But hold on, David, before you get to that.
Yeah.
Are you saying, and are you saying in the piece, and you've obviously done a lot of research in this, are you saying that people like Rahm Emanuel and Gavin Newsom are quite literally throwing the trans community under the bus? Are they saying that, I mean, there's 2 ways of arguing this. On the one hand, they can say, well, it's not really our priority. Obviously, we support trans rights, but we're simply not going to focus on it. And that tends to be a vote loser. Or are they actually almost implicitly saying that they don't care about trans rights? They're 2 quite different things.
Maybe they're different by design, but by consequence, they're the same. Because when, for example, the governor of Iowa, Kim Reynolds, who's a maniac on many issues, signs a bill into law stripping away civil rights protections from trans Americans. So now it's legal in Iowa to fire someone for being transgender. When
just by being a transgendered person, that gives an employer the right to fire them.
Yes, yes. I mean, this may go to the Supreme Court, but this is now Iowa state law. In Texas, you may have heard about the bill that would make identifying as transgender to an employer or to a municipal or state office a crime, punishable by the law, because it's something they call gender deception. So for Gavin Newsom and for Seth Moulton in Massachusetts and others whom I identify in the piece, and Rahm Emanuel, who, let's not forget, left office in Chicago in disgrace after helping to conceal the police murder of a black teenager. He left office with an 18% approval rating, and yet now he's an oracle. When they say, let's forget about transgender people, let's not talk about them, they're really saying, we are no longer going to guard an endangered minority who happens to vote for our party against this attack, a coordinated nationwide attack on their civil rights, on their healthcare and educational accommodations, and on their very humanity. So,
how many, David, and excuse this question because I don't know the answer. Maybe you don't either. How many trans people are there in the United States?
It's according to a recent New York Times report on a large study, it's between 0.6 and 0.8% of the public.
So what does that translate into actual numbers?
Yeah, what does it translate to in actual numbers? I mean,
so you mean six out of 1,000, between 6 and 8 out of 1,000 Americans are trans.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's a considerable number.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, usually people go the other way and say that it's such a small number, and in some respects it is. So all of the hysteria about transgender people in athletics, for example, there are fewer than 10 transgender athletes competing at the college level, and one statistic I was able to find in Michigan, there are 170,000 high school athletes. 2 are trans girls. So this is hysteria about how trans girls are going to ruin women's sports. But in the other sense, we should never allow ourselves to say that a group is so small that a defense of their human rights is not a prerequisite for progressive politics and social liberalism. Native Americans.
Yeah, I agree, and I didn't mean the question in that sense. I was.
Oh, no, I know you didn't. I just wanted to jump in case anyone listening interprets it that way. I mean, Native Americans constitute only 1% of the population. Jews only 2%, and yet we have to defend the rights of everyone. And
yeah, I mean, I'm doing some multitasking here. I think according to one institute, the Williams Institute at UCLA, there's an estimate, and they did their research in 2022. There are 1.6 million trans people in America, which is actually is considerably more than I would have imagined. I don't know about you.
Yeah, well, to hear the number, I guess it's more than one would imagine. But if you look at polling data on what Americans believe, especially Republicans, it's off the charts with Republicans. I mean, they think something like 10% of the American public is transgender. So they have this, they're living in this phantasm of paranoia, imagining that this transgender army is coming for school athletics and coming for the healthcare system, and they're using this to scaffold the assaults on
Is it,
civil rights, but also book bans and
yeah.
punishment of teachers. Oh,
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
mean, everything's focusing on this. And again,
But
I'm going to ask the question that you don't have the answer to, but I wonder whether the 1.6 million trans people in the US, they're mostly on the coast, they're mostly in democratic states. I mean, I have no idea on that either.
That would stand. I don't have an answer, so this is baseless
And
speculation.
presumably they will be anyway, whatever happens, because if places like Iowa start taking away fundamental civil rights from trans people, then they really have
most
no
aren't going
option
to
but to
stay in Des
move.
Moines, right?
I mean, you go from
it would
Des
stand to
Moines,
reason.
yeah.
But I would add to my explanation earlier of writing this piece. One also has to learn and have some awareness of how the revolt against LGBTQ acceptance is an umbrella under which there are many unattractive forces operating in tandem. So we have Christian nationalism, which combines the far right elements of the Vatican with evangelical Christianity. We have anti-feminism, because typically all of these people are also opponents of abortion rights, birth control. They cast everything together in this very primitive, religious extremist view of human sexuality. And then also anti-intellectualism, where we get the book bans and the assaults on education under the guise of supposedly protecting children from knowledge, and even protecting young adults from knowledge of transgender existence. And that demonstrates an authoritarian impulse. So all of this goes together, and the right wingers are very clever and very effective at using their bigotry towards transgender people as a populist wedge issue, and then advancing all the other parts of the agenda behind it. And that's what
It's
we're
interesting
already
that
seeing.
we've done a number of shows in the past on gay marriage, for example, which became an issue that went from being unthinkable and unacceptable for almost everyone, certainly within the Republican, but also within the Democratic Party, to being accepted by everybody in the space of a few years. I wonder what it is about the trans issue that triggers such paranoia, particularly amongst conservatives. Is it the Christian element of fiddling with our biology, literally, or so to speak?
Yeah, I think that's it. If you look at the statements that the Vatican has put out about this, and some of the leading evangelical organizations, there is the accusation that trans people, or people who identify as non-binary, and the liberals who accept it, are playing God, that they're replacing God's natural law of the gender binary with this creative and satanic rearrangement. And a lot of this, of course, is highly projective. So when you have the Vatican putting out statements about protecting children from the transgender menace, I mean, one doesn't know whether to laugh or cry, given that it's well documented that the Vatican has overseen the protection of thousands of pedophiles over the past
Speaking of
several decades.
playing God, I'm not sure if you
Right.
saw the Oscar film Conclave,
I did.
which in part is about a powerful bishop who also is trans, or in part. So it's quite a radical film. In a way, it's a shame that that movie didn't win the Oscar for Best Movie of the Year. It would be a nice statement from Hollywood.
Yeah, and I certainly thought it was a better made film than Honora.
And actually, looking at the numbers now, the numbers are so weird. Another number from USA Facts suggests that 2.3 million Americans identify themselves as transgender. So there's the biological reality, David, and then there's perception. I mean, is there a difference between the two?
Well, now, I mean, I don't know how comfortable I would feel commenting.
We can do it with me. I don't mind.
No,
I'm not asking you to come out as trans.
No, I just mean that I'm not aware of, some of this is beyond my purview because I'm not trans, but I'm sure that there is there's some difference between those who are actually taking medical steps to live as transgender people and those who are still in the stage of mere personal and social identification.
David, do you think that I have some friends with trans kids, and they've been subjected, if that's the right word, to some very painful debates about what they can and can't allow their children, sometimes as young as 13 or 14, to do. Was there or is there a need for some sort of correction on the trans issue? It's such a controversial one. We know J.K. Rowling got involved in it, and it brings out so much intolerance and anger and misunderstanding on all sides.
Well, people who, my heart goes out to people who have transgender children. As we were talking before we went on air, my wife and I don't have any children. So, I mean, in some way, that's something that I can fully understand. But I think that the acceptance, one hopes that we actually start to experience growing acceptance of transgender teenagers and adults, brings with it some new questions and some new sources of puzzlement. And one of those is how to handle the medical issue. It's something that requires more study and more discovery and more inquiry. But I would suggest that the approach that my state government here in Indiana has taken, which is an outright prohibition on gender affirmative care, is precisely the wrong one, because it takes the decision-making power away from those parents, away from their doctors, and by fiat, gives it to a government that knows nothing about the lives of these people. So whatever solution we end up devising to some of these complex, thorny issues, I would hope and advocate for a process of deliberation that promotes medical expertise and the experience of those actually enduring the transition or taking on the transition, as opposed to some Republican politicians who are under the influence of some preachers' ravings in the church or on the radio.
David, Gavin Newsom has actually been on this show a couple of times a few years ago, but he's not on today, and he's busy with other stuff. Michelle Goldberg wrote a piece recently in the Times. What on earth is Gavin Newsom doing? She was actually commenting on his decision to invite Steve Bannon onto his podcast. I do want to talk to you about that decision in a minute, but my guess is that if Newsom was on the show, he wouldn't necessarily disagree with you. He would simply argue, and I think Rahm Emanuel would make the same argument, that the Dems are best just to steer clear of this, that it's not a shameful retreat, that for better or worse, because there's so much ignorance and hysteria about the subject in America amongst conservatives, but also amongst moderates who determine elections, that it's simply best avoided, and that the left took over the Democratic Party. And one of the reasons why they lost the last election was because they became preoccupied with issues associated with stuff like trans, which is a vote loser. How would you respond? I mean, I've kind of asked you that, but more in a full frontal sense, what would you say to Newsom if he came on the show and said that?
Well, first of all, I would say that if he genuinely believes that, he has all of his work in studying totalitarianism ahead of him, because bigotry is ravenous. And we know that the same people pushing this anti-trans junk also have their targets set on gay marriage. Clarence Thomas has said that he'd like the court to revisit that decision and overturn it. Many state governments have passed resolutions calling on the Supreme Court to do just that. Coupled with the anti-trans movement, you have the anti-DEI movement, which affects many, many more people. So that's the first thing, but that's a moral argument. Politically, I would say that why is it that this conversation only tends to go one way? So the Republicans have found the means and methods to adopt all kinds of extremist, dangerous, surreal positions on everything from guns to January 6th. And it doesn't seem to hurt them with moderates, but we're supposed to believe that the Democrats expressing support for the human rights of this small, endangered minority is tantamount to political suicide. As you just pointed out yourself, at one point, that was the argument about gay marriage. And the Democrats could have said, you know what, we're going to give up on gay marriage because it's an electoral loser. Luckily, that argument didn't prevail. So I actually agree with Representative Summer Lee, who I quote in the Salon essay, who said it's not about abandoning persecuted people. That's a moral violation, and that's politically weak. It's about developing better tactics of persuasion. And after all, that's the entire purpose of politics. And finally, I would add that in this new media landscape, things have changed. And it's not that Democrats have to choose between transgender rights and universal health care, or transgender rights and Social Security. One of Trump's skills is that he's very aggressive, and he has a rapid fire delivery in which he comments on everything all the time. Democrats don't have to choose one issue. They can argue all of these issues. And if they can develop a persuasive and rhetorical strategy that enables them to show how all of these issues coordinate in the name of freedom and progressive advancement of everyone's security and prosperity, then they can win the argument. But if they begin to capitulate and look and talk and act like losers, that's going to turn off people, because it's going to look weak, and it's going to alienate their base, who they need to excite to the maximum degree to win elections.
Yeah, and that certainly is true when it comes to Schumer. Nobody looks weaker or more pathetic. It's hard to imagine that he has much of a future, politically at least. Newsom is also... Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, Schumer is the personification of that old political adage, a liberal is someone who leaves the room when a fight breaks out. You know, I mean,
Yeah,
I don't remember who authored that
that
originally,
is
but
a
it's,
great. Yeah, I mean
yeah.
that summarizes him. I mean, he is a truly pathetic character. But coming back to Newsom, he's positioning himself clearly for some sort of national run. Michelle Goldberg, as I said, criticized him because he invited Steve Bannon onto his podcast. He's trying to position himself as maybe a Trump from the left. I mean, if you want to be kind to him. How do you feel about that? You were on the show a couple of months ago talking about why Harris should have gone on the Joe Rogan show. You've written some interesting stuff about David Duke's appearance, Jesse Jackson's determination to debate David Duke and humiliating Duke. So where do you stand on Newsom and Bannon and Newsom's attempt to invent himself as a podcaster who is able to talk to the conservatives?
I have no objection to the objective of Newsom creating a podcast and inviting the MAGA All-Star team to appear on the show. It's the way in which he's doing it that's quite loathsome. So when he had on Charlie Kirk, who
Yeah.
who's the young voter for Trump, outreach specialist, and has said a number of really vile things about women and gays and black people. You know, most recently he said he'd be nervous getting on a plane with a black pilot. You know, Newsom asks him for his advice. He says, you know, how do you guys do what we do? What can we learn from you? And it's like, you know, you've lied about all of my constituents, and you've turned, you know, half of the electorate into a paranoid, delusional mess ready to fight against institutional democracy. You know, give us some of that. How can we do it? I mean, it just looks pitiful, and it looks obsequious. And the key word, you know, when I wrote about Jesse Jackson debating Duke, the key word in your summary of that is humiliate. Jackson ended up humiliating Duke. Newsom, by allowing Bannon, as another example, to state that the 2020 election was stolen with no challenge, no riposte, ends up humiliating himself. And again, there is an appetite right now for Democratic voters to see leaders rise to the challenge and fight. If Newsom was inviting these people on a shared platform and taking them to task, not just lecturing and screaming at them, because then no one would come on, but debating them in a very aggressive and tough way, rather than agreeing with them, asking for their advice, and allowing their lies to go unchecked and unchallenged, he would ingratiate himself to voters. But instead, he's turning people off. You know, we don't want capitulation. We want confrontation.
Intelligent confrontation, a
Yes,
la
intelligent confrontation.
Jesse
Like I said, not
Jackson.
screaming and not. And if you
Right.
go back, and we won't redo the previous episode of the show, but if somebody reads what I wrote about Jackson with Duke, or even watches the video for themselves, they'll see that's exactly what Jackson did. He sat quietly, allowed Duke to speak, and then methodically dismantled his racist paranoia and prejudice. That's what we should see right now from Newsom.
You talked earlier about gay rights, gay marriage. In your piece, you talk about something called the Stonewall erasure. What is that, and what does it mean, and what does it tell us about Trump's attitude to gay American rights?
Well, it's not so much about gays. It's more about the transgender piece of it. the National Park Service, under the direction of the Trump administration, I don't know if it was Trump personally, but Trump certainly permitted it, has erased from the website on the Stonewall Rebellion any reference to transgender Americans,
Oh, I see.
and it's even erased the T. So now it says that it was, I'm paraphrasing, but a pivotal moment in the
Right. So there was another
LGB.
piece in Salon, can't spell history without a T. Hundreds protest Trump's trans erasure at
Right. Now,
Stonewall.
this is not only a violation of the facts, because we know that two of the key participants in the Stonewall Revolt were transgender women, but also it lands Trump in a pattern of what I call in the essay a totalitarian termination of knowledge. And I quote, it's a bit cliched to quote him, but it was a perfect opportunity. I quote George Orwell's description in his novel 1984 of the memory hole. Trump's trying to drop, Trump and his supporters, these religious extremists who surround him, are trying to drop transgender history into the memory hole. And that again indicates a very dangerous and alarming authoritarian impulse that, again, I would warn the Newsoms and the Emanuels, if you allow it to happen on one issue, that's in itself a moral abomination, but it's an invitation to further political destruction, because then they're just going to move on and do it with another issue. Shannon Parker, who's the CEO of a transgender-led social service agency or nonprofit in Chicago, recently compared it to a menu in a restaurant and said that trans people are the first course. And once this crowd gets through with the first course, they're going to move on to the next course. And we know that's how bigots and autocrats and religious extremists always operate. I mean, one need only take one history course to learn that
Right.
that
And as
is
you
the
said,
script.
I'm quoting you here. I hadn't heard this term. Bigotry is ravenous. And the first course doesn't satiate
Yeah,
anyone's
it
hunger.
doesn't
It just
satisfy.
adds to the hunger. So,
So
yeah,
yeah,
and you end the
next we're
piece
going to
by
have
saying
gay.
that and I'm quoting you, bigotry is not only menacing, it's also ravenous and contagious. Anyone who believes that theocratic Republicans will stop at trans people is delusional. I wonder who is standing up to the Trump people on the trans issue. Lot of stories about Maine. There was that interaction between Trump and the Maine governor, which went viral. I know that there's a Maine lawmaker now who is suing the House Speaker over a censure for a post on transgender athletes. Is the real resistance to this coming from the states, David?
Perhaps it is, and there's an inspiring and hopeful story, or I should say, hope engendering story out of Montana recently. Perhaps you heard that Montana had two bills on its legislative floor aimed at transgender people. One had to do with the schools, one had to do with civil protections more broadly. And as you can imagine, Montana's state house is dominated by Republicans. So they initially had the votes, but a number of Democrats stood up, including two transgender women who, by some miracle, are in the Montana state government. They stood up and gave these brilliant speeches about how the passage of these bills would create many calamities and it's morally wrong. and enough Republicans switched their votes to kill the bills. So that shows the power of persuasion, and that our democracy can still work, and that resistance is not futile. And that also bolsters the argument of Massachusetts Congresswoman Summer Lee, who again said the solution to this problem is not to abandon transgender people, a vulnerable constituency, but to formulate better arguments and better rhetoric.
She said, you quote her, there is no poll result that could make me turn on marginalized people. What I challenge us to do is find maybe better or different ways to protect folks, and better and different ways to lift up the messaging that resonates with the people. So it's a rejoinder to Newsom and to Rahm Emanuel. I have to admit, when I saw your piece, I was slightly ambivalent, but the more I think about it, the more I actually agree with you. I've always been slightly skeptical of people comparing Trump or MAGA with European fascism or the Nazis. I think it's an exaggeration. But I think in this sense, there's something in it. I mean, they're clearly trying to get rid of transgendered people. I mean, we haven't arrived yet at the camps for them, but even that's conceivable, David, isn't it?
Yes, right. That's why concessions to this hatred are terribly ill-advised. I agree with you that a comparison of Trump to the Nazis is an exaggeration, but to appropriate some of this, LGBTQ language, we could say there's a spectrum on which authoritarianism exists, and the Trump people are certainly on that spectrum. And I'm glad that I've persuaded you on the issue. I mean, sometimes as a writer, as you know, you feel like you're shouting into a void, and so it's always flattering and reassuring and encouraging when you know that you've convinced a learned person like yourself.
Well, you're being very generous. I just think I'm a mainstream Democrat. In Biden's America, the trans community was pretty outspoken, and sometimes, at least from my point of view, could be a little annoying and bullying in themselves, although I'm sure they wouldn't agree. What's happened to the trans community in these 3 months since Trump's come to power? Have they shut up? How are they responding?
Yeah, well, that's part of what's so shocking about this is the rapidity of this regression. That, I quote Biden in the piece, speaking really passionately about transgender rights, something that hardly any Democrat is willing to do now. There's certainly, transgender writers who are out there and making their case. I suppose maybe just the moment isn't theirs. They had a moment, and now, due to some media capitulation and due to the Democrats' capitulation, they're no longer in the spotlight. And there is a left-wing bullying that exists, and so I wouldn't dispute or object to your characterization. But that's not the case with someone like Sarah McBride, transgender woman currently serving in Congress, the first trans person elected to Congress. That's not the case with someone like Masha Gessen, who's a brilliant transgender writer, often for the New Yorker and the New York Times. So the voices are out there. We have to know where to find them, I guess.
Yeah, and some of the stuff that the Trump people have done already. I mean, we're only 2 or 3 months into this thing. Trans women have been transferred to men's prisons. He lied about a lot of his anti-transgender comments in his Congress speech last month. And they're targeting lots of different ways that they're targeting transgendered people. Lots of pieces about not feeling safe as a transgendered person if you're traveling, if you leave the country, if you come into the country. So there are chilling reminders, if not of fascism, certainly of the nastiest kind of authoritarianism, David, isn't there?
Exactly. Yeah, and hate crimes against trans
Yeah, I mean,
people
the
have been on
troops,
the
the
rise.
stuff in the army always seems, or the military always seems to be an area where this gets argued out about Trump's Pentagon banning transgendered troops.
And then there's just so many absurdities as well. I mean, Trump in his State of the Union referred to a CDC program to make mice transgender, when in reality it's transgenic, which is an experiment done on mice to, in my understanding, inject them with viruses and things of that nature to see how their immune systems respond. So, there's this idea that transgenderism is everywhere, and it's this ubiquitous force that's going to trouble and haunt us all. And that too shows shades of authoritarianism, even fascism, this exaggeration of a threat. So therefore, those who want to assault those people can adopt a defensive posture. Well, we're defending against the threat. We're not the threat. So, the Trump mice example shows the idiocy at work in some of this. But Gore Vidal once said, "I love stupidity. It excites me." This is exciting in a way that is also cause for great concern.
Yeah, and you're convincing me even more, because it'd be one thing for the Trump people to come out explicitly against African Americans or gay people, who make up a much larger minority, tens of millions of people, as opposed to the 1 million trans people. And one can imagine in the masterful way that Trump does media, that he would suddenly announce that they are setting up camps to protect trans people.
Yeah, I mean, you could see this living in this phantasm makes anything possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's Orwellian. And you wake up one morning and you're at war with TransAsia, the next morning you're at war with somebody else.
Right. That's exactly it. And if Trump were to come out and announce Trump has carefully selected two of the most vulnerable and politically unpopular groups with which to begin his war, his authoritarian rollback of civil rights, and that's transgender Americans and illegal immigrants.
Yeah.
And that, as I said, forgive me for repeating myself, we should oppose those things on the merits themselves, but also oppose them with the historical awareness and sensitivity to how.
Although the illegal, I mean, maybe this would be another piece, David, for another salon piece, but the illegal immigrant stuff is, and I don't want to get sucked into that, and I'm sure you don't either. We're at the end of this conversation, but it's a slightly different issue. Whereas trans Americans are Americans, they should have the same civil rights as any other American.
And I agree with that.
Well, it's an important piece. It's not going to be a popular piece, certainly not amongst Republicans, but even amongst some Democrats. David Masciotra argues that the Dems have staged a shameful retreat on trans rights. I think, in retrospect, I wasn't convinced when I first read it and saw it, but I think he's right. You have to stand up for yourself. You have to draw a line in the sand, and the Democrats need to do that. Clearly, Chuck Schumer isn't, so maybe we need to rely on younger Democrats like AOC. We will see. Lots more to discuss, David. This story for better or worse, is only just beginning. As always, great to have you on the show. Great that you're bravely writing these sorts of pieces, which aren't necessarily going to make you particularly popular. Stay well, stay safe, David. Keep on writing and telling the truth. We need you. And we'll talk again in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure as always.
Can I step on the sea?